The winter of 1463 had descended upon the English countryside with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. Snow lay thick across the fields of Yorkshire, burying the remnants of autumn beneath a silence so complete that even the ravens had abandoned their posts along the castle walls. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down upon the land like a judgment waiting to be pronounced. Within the great hall of Thornwood Castle, firelight danced across stone walls blackened by centuries of smoke, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like tortured spirits. The tapestries that adorned those walls, hunting scenes, battles won, ancestors long dead, seemed to watch the proceedings below with the patient disapproval of the departed. Lord Sebastian Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Thornwood, stood at the high window overlooking his domain, his breath misting against the frozen glass. At 30 winters old, he carried himself with the particular weariness of a man who had inherited too much too young and found the weight of it heavier than any armor he had ever worn. His dark hair fell past his shoulders in the fashion of the nobility, and his jaw bore the shadow of a beard he had neglected to trim for days. Behind him, the fire crackled and spat, and the voices of his companions rose and fell like the tide. "You grow tedious, Ashford." The speaker was Lord Reginald Blackwood, Baron of Eastmere, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his boredom. He lounged in a carved oak chair near the hearth, his boots propped upon a hunting hound that had long since learned not to protest. 3 months since Lady Eleanor rejected your suit, and still you mope about like a monk denied his prayers. Sebastian did not turn from the window. Beyond the glass, the snow continued to fall, each flake a small surrender to the inevitable. Lady Eleanor made her choice, he said quietly. I do not fault her for it. You should fault someone. Reginald drained his goblet and gestured for a servant to refill it. A duke does not simply accept rejection from an earl's daughter. It upsets the natural order of things. Perhaps the natural order requires upsetting. The words drew a sharp laugh from Reginald, though there was no warmth in it. He had known Sebastian since their boyhood days at court, had watched him transform from a reckless youth into this contemplative stranger who seemed more interested in philosophy than power. It irritated him in ways he could not quite articulate. What you require, Reginald said, leaning forward with the gleam of malice in his eyes, is a distraction. Something to remind the court that the Duke of Thornwood is not a man to be pitied or dismissed. I have no interest in the court's opinion. Then you are a fool. Reginald rose from his chair and crossed to stand beside Sebastian at the window. His reflection joined the Duke's in the frosted glass. 2 men of similar birth, separated by everything that mattered. The court's opinion is the only currency that matters in this kingdom. Without it, you are merely a man with land. With it, you are a force that shapes the realm itself. Sebastian turned at last to face him. In the firelight, his features seemed carved from the same stone as the castle walls. Hard, weathered, enduring. What precisely are you suggesting? Reginald's smile widened, revealing teeth that had been filed to points in some barbaric fashion he claimed was the style in France. I am suggesting a wager, my lord. One that would remind everyone from York to London that the Duke of Thornwood bows to no convention. I do not gamble. You gamble every time you draw breath in this kingdom. Every alliance, every marriage, every word spoken at court. All of it is gambling with stakes higher than gold. Reginald gestured toward the window. But if it is gold that interests you, I offer 10,000 crowns, against your word alone. Despite himself, Sebastian felt a flicker of curiosity. 10,000 crowns was a fortune, enough to repair the eastern wing of the castle, to feed the village through the winter, to fund the hospital for wounded soldiers he had long dreamed of building. And what would I have to do to earn such a sum? Reginald's smile became something darker. There is a girl in your kitchen, a Moorish girl, brought here by traders and sold to your household when she was but a child. I have seen her when I visited. She has grown into something almost beautiful, in a savage way. Sebastian felt something cold settle into his chest. Amara. Is that her name? How quaint. Reginald waved a dismissive hand. The wager is simple. Treat her as a lady. Bring her to the Easter feast at court. Present her as your chosen companion. Not as servant, but as equal. Watch how the nobility recoils, how the whispers spread, how the very foundations of their precious hierarchy tremble. His eyes gleamed with anticipated pleasure. Maintain the pretense for 2 months. If you succeed without breaking, without revealing it as a jest, the gold is yours. And if I refuse, then you confirm what everyone already believes, that the Duke of Thornwood has become a coward who hides in his castle because he cannot face the world he was born to command. The words struck like a blow. Sebastian turned back to the window, his jaw tight with emotions he could not name. Beyond the glass, the snow had begun to ease, and through the thinning veil he could see the distant lights of the village. The families huddled together for warmth, the children who went hungry when the harvest failed, the old men who remembered when the Ashworths had been lords worth following. He thought of Lady Eleanor, whose rejection had been delivered with such elegant cruelty. He thought of his father, who had died believing his son would bring glory to their name. He thought of the endless procession of noble faces at court, each one a mask hiding ambitions and deceits he had grown too tired to navigate. And then he thought of Amara. He had noticed her, of course. One could not help but notice her. The way she moved through the castle like a shadow made flesh. The way her dark eyes observed everything while revealing nothing. The way her hands shaped bread with a tenderness that seemed almost sacred. She had been part of his household for 15 years, since his father had purchased her from a merchant ship as an act of charity that the old Duke had never quite explained. In all that time, Sebastian had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times. He realized with a shame that surprised him, that he did not even know if she could read. "You ask me to use a woman as a weapon against the very society she must survive within," Sebastian said slowly, "to make a spectacle of her existence for sport. I ask you to remember who you are." Reginald placed a hand on Sebastian's shoulder, his grip firm through the velvet of the Duke's doublet. "You are not some merchant's son who must bow and scrape for approval. You are Thornwood. Your ancestors built this kingdom. If you choose to elevate a kitchen girl to the status of a lady, who has the right to tell you otherwise?" The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Sebastian recognized the manipulation beneath it. Reginald wanted entertainment, wanted to watch the court convulse with outrage, wanted to see Sebastian humiliated or triumphant, and cared not which. But beneath that manipulation lay a truth that Sebastian could not quite dismiss. He had spent his entire life following the rules that others had written. Marriage for alliance, friendship for advantage, every emotion filtered through the lens of what was proper and expected. And where had it brought him? To an empty castle, a rejected proposal, and a reputation for weakness that spread through the court like plague. Perhaps it was time to write his own rules. "I accept," Sebastian heard himself say, "but with conditions. No one is to know of the wager until it is complete. Amara is to be treated with respect by you and your household, regardless of the outcome. And if I win, the gold goes to the village, not to my coffers." Reginald's eyebrows rose, but he extended his hand. "Agreed. Though I confess, your concern for the girl is almost touching. One might think you actually cared about her welfare." Sebastian clasped the offered hand, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle onto his shoulders like chainmail. "One might think many things, Lord Blackwood. Few of them accurate." They parted as the fire burned low, Reginald returning to his goblet, and Sebastian to his contemplation of the snow. But something had shifted in the air between them. Something that felt less like an agreement, and more like the opening move in a game neither of them fully understood. When the last of the firelight had faded to embers, Sebastian made his way through the darkened corridors of the castle toward the kitchen. His footsteps echoed against the stone, each sound a small announcement of his approach. He told himself he was merely surveying his domain, performing the duties expected of a lord. He told himself many things that night. The kitchen was warm with the residual heat of the day's cooking, the great hearth still glowing with banked coals. Copper pots hung from iron hooks, their surfaces catching what little light remained and throwing it back in fractured patterns. The air smelled of bread and herbs, of honest labor and simple sustenance. Amara was alone, kneading dough on a scarred wooden table, her movements rhythmic and precise. She had not heard him approach, or if she had, she gave no sign of it. Her focus remained entirely on the task before her, her dark hands working the pale flower with a kind of meditation that seemed almost holy. Sebastian watched her for a long moment from the doorway. In the dim light, her features seemed carved from ebony. The high cheekbones, the full lips, the proud set of her jaw that spoke of ancestors who had ruled their own kingdoms long before England had learned to build in stone. She was 25 winters old, he knew from the household records, which made her 5 years his junior. She had come to Thornwood as a child of 10, purchased from a merchant ship in Bristol for a sum his father had never disclosed. Purchased. The word sat uneasily in Sebastian's mind. He had never thought much about what it meant, had simply accepted her presence as he accepted the presence of the tapestries and the hunting hounds and all the other possessions that came with his birthright. But now, watching her work in the half-darkness, he found himself wondering what she remembered of the life before, what she had lost, what she dreamed of in the small hours of the night. "You watch me." Her voice cut through his thoughts like a blade through silk. She had not looked up from her work, had not paused in her kneading, and yet she knew he was there. Had known, perhaps, from the moment he had appeared in the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude," Sebastian said. "And yet you intrude." Now she did look up, and her eyes met his with a directness that no servant should have shown to a lord. "The kitchen is my domain after dark, your grace. What brings you to it?" Sebastian found himself without a ready answer. The truth, that he had come to observe her like some creature he intended to hunt, felt suddenly monstrous. The lie, that he was merely passing through, felt beneath them both. "I came to speak with you," he said at last, "about a matter of some importance." Amara's hands stilled on the dough. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Then, slowly, she wiped her hands on her apron and straightened to her full height. She was tall for a woman, Sebastian realized, nearly as tall as he was himself. In all the years she had lived beneath his roof, he had never noticed. "If you have found fault with my work," she began. "No, nothing of the kind." Sebastian stepped into the kitchen, closing the distance between them until only the table stood as barrier. "I have a proposal to make, one that may sound strange at first hearing. Stranger than the lord of the castle seeking out his kitchen maid at midnight?" Despite himself, Sebastian felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Perhaps equally strange. Amara waited, her silence more eloquent than any words. Sebastian drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. In the morning, he knew. This conversation would seem like madness, the fevered dream of a man who had drunk too much wine and slept too little. But standing here now, in the warmth of her kitchen with the snow still falling beyond the frosted windows, it felt like the only true thing he had done in years. "I wish to present you at court," he said, "not as a servant, but as a lady of rank, to have gowns made for you, to teach you the dances and courtesies of the nobility, to walk beside you into the great hall of the king himself, and watch every lord and lady in England choke on their own assumptions." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "You mock me," Amara said at last, and there was something in her voice that Sebastian had never heard before, a crack in the composure she wore like armor, revealing the wound beneath. "I do not mock." Sebastian moved around the table, coming to stand before her without the barrier of wood between them. This close, he could see the flour dusting her cheekbones, the way her breath came quick and shallow, the pulse that beat at the hollow of her throat. "I offer you the chance to be seen as you deserve to be seen, not as property, not as servant, but as a woman of worth and dignity. And in exchange?" The question cut to the heart of everything. Sebastian hesitated, knowing that the next words he spoke would determine whether this mad venture succeeded or collapsed before it had begun. "In exchange, I ask only that you trust me, for 2 months, until Easter has passed and the court has had its fill of scandal. After that, you may return to whatever life you choose, with a dowry sufficient to ensure your independence, regardless of the outcome." Amara studied him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You do not tell me the whole truth, your grace." No, I do not. There is a wager involved. A game of some kind, played among men who have never known what it means to be wagered upon. Sebastian felt the blood drain from his face. How did you... I have ears. I have eyes. I have survived 15 years in a castle full of people who assume I am too simple to understand their schemes. Amara's voice hardened. Lord Blackwood proposed this. You accepted. And now you come to me with pretty words about dignity and worth, as if I could not see the knife hidden behind your smile. The accusation hung between them like smoke from a doused fire. Sebastian found he could not deny it, could not summon the courtier's ease with which he had deflected so many other truths throughout his life. You are right, he said quietly. There is a wager. Lord Blackwood believes that treating you as an equal will destroy my reputation at court. He believes that the scandal will ruin me. Sebastian met her eyes without flinching. I intend to prove him wrong. And if you fail? If the court turns against you, if your lands are seized, your title stripped? Amara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the flower and herbs that clung to her skin. What happens to me then, your grace? Where does the kitchen girl go when the lord who pretended to elevate her has fallen? It was a question Sebastian had not considered. In his anger at Reginald, in his weariness with the games of nobility, he had thought only of the grand gesture, the statement that would shake the foundations of everything he had been taught to believe. He had not thought about what would happen to the woman at the center of it all. I will protect you, he said. Whatever happens, I will ensure. You cannot ensure anything. Amara's voice was gentle now, almost kind. You are a duke, but you are also a man. And men have promised protection to women like me for 1,000 years, only to abandon them when the cost became too high. She turned away from him then, returning to her dough with the same rhythmic precision as before. Her back was straight, her shoulders set, her hands steady as they worked the flour and water into something that might, given time and heat, become sustenance. Sebastian watched her for a long moment, feeling something shift within him that he could not name. It was not desire, or not only desire. It was something deeper and more unsettling, the dawning recognition that he was standing before a person he had never truly seen, a mind he had never troubled to know, a soul he had dismissed without thought for 15 years. I will not force you, he said at last. The choice is yours, but know this. Whatever my reasons for beginning this, I will not end it by abandoning you to the wolves. That much at least I can promise. Amara did not turn around, but her hands stilled on the dough, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I will think on it, your grace. Come to me tomorrow, and I will give you my answer. Sebastian nodded, though she could not see it. He turned and walked from the kitchen, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors of his castle like the beating of a heart he had forgotten he possessed. Behind him, in the warmth of the hearth's dying glow, Amara remained alone with her dough and her thoughts, and the impossible choice that had been laid before her. The snow continued to fall beyond the frosted windows, each flake a small surrender to forces beyond anyone's control. And in the darkness of her solitude, she allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to be seen. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories that celebrate courage, challenge injustice, and reveal the transformative power of unexpected love touch your heart, then subscribe now, because Amara's answer will change everything, and you will want to witness every moment of what comes next. 3 days had passed since the midnight conversation in the kitchen, and the castle of Thornwood had begun to stir with rumors that spread like fire through dry wheat. The seamstresses had arrived first, 3 women from York with bolts of velvet and silk packed in oiled leather cases, their needles flashing in the candlelight as they measured and cut and stitched with the focused intensity of artists given a worthy commission. They had been told only that a lady required a wardrobe suitable for court. They had not been told who that lady was. The discovery had come on the 2nd day, when Amara had been summoned from the kitchen to stand upon a wooden platform in the solar, while the seamstresses circled her like wolves around a wounded doe. The head seamstress, a woman named Margaret with silver streaking her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing, had paused with her measuring cord in hand, her gaze traveling from Amara's flour-dusted hands to her simple homespun dress to the proud lift of her chin. "Well," Margaret had said at last, her voice carefully neutral, "this will be interesting work indeed." Word had spread from there, carried by servants' whispers and stable boys' gossip, until every soul within Thornwood's walls knew that the Duke intended to present his kitchen maid as a lady of the court. The reactions had been varied: shock from some, amusement from others, and from a few, a quiet admiration that they dared not voice aloud. Sebastian had watched it all from the shadows of his study, observing the ripples that spread outward from the stone he had cast into the still waters of his household. He had expected resistance, perhaps even defiance. What he had not expected was the strange pride that seemed to take root among his servants, the careful attention they now paid to Amara's comfort, the extra courtesies extended without being asked. It was as if, by elevating one of their own, he had elevated them all. On the fourth morning, Sebastian descended to the great hall to find Amara standing before the massive fireplace, dressed in a gown of deep burgundy velvet that transformed her from kitchen maid to something approaching royalty. The seamstresses had worked through the night to complete it, and their skill showed in every stitch, the way the fabric draped across her shoulders, the intricate embroidery that traced golden vines along the bodice, the train that pooled at her feet like spilled wine. But it was not the gown that stopped Sebastian in his tracks. It was the way she wore it. There was no hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in the set of her shoulders. She stood as if she had been born to velvet and gold, as if the crown jewels themselves would not have been beyond her reach. And when she turned to face him, her dark eyes held a challenge that made his breath catch in his throat. "Your Grace," she said, and even her voice had changed, still low and musical, but with a new edge of authority that had not been there before. "I trust the gown meets with your approval." Sebastian found that words had abandoned him. He crossed the hall slowly, his boots echoing against the stone floor, his eyes never leaving her face. Up close, he could see the details the seamstresses had added: tiny pearls sewn along the neckline, gold thread that caught the firelight and threw it back in fractured patterns. "You are—" He paused, searching for language adequate to the moment. "You are remarkable. I am the same woman I was 4 days ago." Amara's chin lifted slightly. "The gown has changed nothing. The gown has changed everything." Sebastian reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the embroidered sleeve. The velvet was soft beneath his fingers, warm from her skin. 4 days ago, you were invisible. Now, you are impossible to ignore. "I was never invisible, Your Grace. You simply chose not to see." The words struck like a blade, all the more painful for their truth. Sebastian withdrew his hand, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks despite the chill of the hall. "You are right," he said quietly, "and I am sorry for it." Something flickered in Amara's expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of something warmer. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the entrance of the hall. It was Thomas, the castle's master of arms, a grizzled veteran of 3 wars who had served the Ashworth family since Sebastian's grandfather's time. He approached with the particular wariness of a man who had seen much and trusted little. "Your Grace, the dancing master has arrived from London." Sebastian nodded, grateful for the interruption that saved him from whatever he had been about to say. "Send him to the Solar. We will begin immediately." Thomas hesitated, his eyes moving from Sebastian to Amara and back again. There was no judgment in his gaze, only the careful assessment of a soldier evaluating a battlefield. "The household is talking, my lord. Word will reach the court before the week is out." "Let it reach them." Sebastian's voice hardened. "The court has talked about me for months. It is time they had something true to discuss." Thomas nodded slowly, as if some question had been answered that he had not quite dared to ask. He turned and withdrew, his footsteps fading into the stone corridors. In the silence that followed, Amara moved to stand beside Sebastian, close enough that he could smell the lavender water the seamstresses had provided for her bath. "He worries for you," she said softly. "They all do. Your servants, your household. They see what you are doing as a kind of warfare against the very world that sustains you. Perhaps it is." Sebastian turned to face her, and in the firelight, The distance between them seemed to shrink to nothing. Perhaps I have grown tired of a world that judges worth by the accident of birth rather than the content of character. Pretty words. Amara's voice was gentle, but her eyes remained sharp. But words alone will not protect either of us when the court decides to strike. Then we must be more than words. Sebastian reached out and took her hand, a liberty no servant would have tolerated, and one that no lady would have accepted from a man not her husband or betrothed. But Amara did not pull away. Her fingers curled around his, warm and strong, and for a moment they stood together in a silence that felt like the beginning of something neither had expected. "Teach me," Amara said at last. "Everything I need to know to walk into that hall and meet their eyes without flinching. The dances, the courtesies, the language they use to wound without leaving marks. Teach me to be their equal, and I will show them that equality is not something that can be given or withheld by those who believe themselves superior." Sebastian felt something shift within him, the same strange sensation he had experienced in the kitchen, but stronger now, more insistent. It was as if a door had opened in a room he had not known existed, revealing a landscape he had never imagined. "It will not be easy," he warned. "The court is cruel, and they will search for any weakness, any flaw they can exploit. You will be tested in ways that no amount of preparation can fully anticipate. I have been tested every day of my life since the slavers took me from my mother's arms." Amara's voice was steady, but beneath the calm surface, Sebastian glimpsed the depth of pain that lay beneath. "I have survived chains and ships, and the casual cruelty of those who saw me as property. I can survive the whispers of nobles who have never known true hardship." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with a history he had never troubled to learn. Sebastian felt the shame of his ignorance wash over him like a cold tide, but beneath it was something else. A growing admiration for the woman who had endured so much and emerged with her spirit unbroken. "Then we begin today," he said, "and we do not stop until you are ready to face them all." The weeks that followed were a kind of crucible, burning away everything that did not serve and leaving behind only what was essential. The dancing master, a precise, humorless man named Geoffrey, arrived each morning to guide Amara through the intricate steps of court dances, the pavane, the galliard, the basse danse, each one a language of its own, speaking of status and alliance through the movement of bodies across a polished floor. Amara learned quickly, her natural grace translating into mastery that surprised even Geoffrey himself. "She has a gift," he told Sebastian one evening, his usual reserve softened by genuine admiration. "I have trained the daughters of earls who moved like cart-horse compared to her. But dancing was only the beginning." Sebastian himself took charge of her education in the subtler arts of court survival, the hidden meanings behind formal phrases, the hierarchy of bows and curtsies that signaled relationship and rank, the dangerous waters of court gossip where a single misplaced word could destroy a reputation that had taken generations to build. They spent long hours in the library, surrounded by manuscripts and legal texts, as Sebastian explained the complex web of alliances and enmities that shaped English politics. Amara absorbed it all with the same focused intensity she brought to her dancing, asking questions that revealed a mind both quick and penetrating. "Why do Lord Blackwood and the Earl of Wessex hate each other?" she asked one afternoon, her finger tracing the lines of a genealogical chart Sebastian had drawn. "Their grandfathers fought on opposite sides during the Wars of Succession. The wounds have never healed. And yet they attend the same feasts, bow to the same king, pretend civility while plotting each other's downfall." Amara looked up at him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "It is not so different from the village where I was born. The same feuds passed from generation to generation, the same hatred worn like inheritance." Sebastian felt his heart constrict. "You remember your village?" "I remember the sky there, the way the dust rose from the red earth when the wind came, the sound of my mother singing as she prepared the evening meal." Amara's voice was distant, touched by a sorrow that seemed to reach across oceans and years. "I remember the moment the slavers came, and the screaming, and then nothing, only darkness, and the smell of the ship's hold and the moaning of those who did not survive the crossing." She had never spoken of her past before. Not to Sebastian. Not to anyone in the household as far as he knew. The revelation hung between them like a sacred thing, fragile and profound. "How old were you?" Sebastian asked softly. 8 winters. Perhaps 9. We did not count years as the English do. Amara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the distant sorrow had been replaced by something harder. "I was sold 3 times before your father found me in the Bristol market. He paid 6 gold crowns for me, less than he would have paid for a good hunting horse." Sebastian felt sick. He had known, in the abstract way one knows unpleasant truths, that Amara had been purchased. But hearing the details, the price, the market, the casual transaction that had determined the course of her life, made the horror of it visceral and immediate. "I did not know," he said, "about any of it. You did not ask." There was no accusation in her voice, only a weary acceptance. "No one ever asks. It is easier to see a servant than to see a person with a history that might disturb your comfort." Sebastian rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her so that their eyes were level. It was a position no duke would assume before a servant, and he saw the shock register on her face before she could mask it. "I am asking now," he said. "Tell me everything you wish to tell. I will listen." For a long moment, Amara simply looked at him, searching his face for some sign of mockery or manipulation. Finding none, she began to speak. She told him of her village in the land the Portuguese called Guinea, where her father had been a craftsman who made jewelry from gold and copper, and her mother had been a healer whose knowledge of plants had been sought by neighboring tribes. She told him of the night the slavers came, men who spoke a language she did not know, who carried weapons that breathed fire and death. She told him of the march to the coast, the chains that rubbed her wrists raw, the ship that became a floating tomb for so many of those who had shared her fate. She told him of survival, of learning English from the cook who had purchased her in Lisbon, of working her way north through households that saw her as an oddity to be displayed, or a burden to be rid of. She told him of arriving at Thornwood, half-starved and fevered, and being nursed back to health by his father's kindness and his mother's indifference. And she told him, finally, of the years that followed, the slow accumulation of small victories that had allowed her to rise from scullery maid to kitchen worker to her current position, each step fought for against those who believed her incapable of learning anything beyond the most basic tasks. When she finished, the fire had burned low and the shadows had grown long across the library floor. Sebastian remained where he was, kneeling before her. His eyes wet with tears, he made no effort to hide. "I have spent my whole life believing that the world I was born into was right and natural," he said quietly, "that the hierarchies of birth and blood reflected some divine order that could not be questioned. And yet here you sit, a woman who has endured more in 30 years than I will face in a lifetime. And I am supposed to believe that my blood makes me your superior?" Amara reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. It was an intimacy that neither of them had planned, but which felt, in that moment, as inevitable as the falling of night. "You are not your blood," she said. "You are your choices. And you are choosing right now to see me as I am, rather than as your world has taught you to see me." A small smile touched her lips. "That is more than most would do." Sebastian caught her hand and held it against his cheek, feeling the warmth of her palm, the strength in her fingers. Something was happening between them, something that had nothing to do with wagers or court politics or the game he had agreed to play, something that felt, against all reason, like the beginning of love. "When we go to court," he said, "they will try to destroy you. They will call you savage and pretender and worse. They will do everything in their power to make you feel small and worthless and alone. I know. And I will stand beside you through all of it, whatever comes." Amara's smile widened, and in her dark eyes, Sebastian saw a light that had not been there before, the light of trust, hard-earned and freely given. "I believe you," she said. "God help me, but I believe you." The journey from Thornwood to Westminster took 4 days by carriage, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation that neither could fully imagine. The roads were treacherous with mud and early spring rain, and more than once the horses had to be led by hand through flooded sections that threatened to swallow the wheels entirely. Amara spent much of the journey in silence, watching the English countryside pass beyond the carriage windows. The land was so different from her memories of home. Green where Guinea had been golden, cold where Guinea had been warm, but alive with its own kind of beauty that she was only beginning to appreciate. Sebastian sat across from her, pretending to read a book of Latin verse while actually watching her from behind the cover of the pages. In the weeks since their conversation in the library, something had shifted between them. A growing ease that manifested in small touches and shared glances and conversations that lasted long into the night. They had not spoken of what it meant. Neither was ready to name the feeling that was growing between them, knowing that to name it would be to acknowledge its impossibility. A duke and a former slave. A lord and his servant. The world they were about to enter would never accept such a union, and yet the world they had left behind no longer felt like the only world that existed. On the morning of the fourth day, the spires of Westminster Abbey appeared through the mist like the fingers of a giant reaching toward heaven. Amara felt her heart quicken at the sight, and for the first time since leaving Thornwood, fear crept into her chest. "It is not too late to turn back," Sebastian said quietly. Amara shook her head. "It was too late the moment I said yes." The Palace of Westminster was a labyrinth of stone corridors and vast halls, each one filled with nobles whose eyes followed Amara with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Sebastian had sent word ahead of their arrival, but nothing could have prepared the court for the reality of what they witnessed. A black woman dressed in the finest silks, walking beside one of the realm's most powerful dukes, as if she had every right to be there. The whispers began, before they had even reached the great hall. "Is that the Moorish girl? The one from his kitchen? How dare he bring such a creature here? Has Ashworth gone mad?" Sebastian heard every word, felt every stare like a blade against his skin. Beside him, Amara walked with her head high and her eyes forward, betraying nothing of whatever she felt inside. He had never admired her more. The great hall was ablaze with candlelight and the gleam of gold, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Hundreds of nobles filled the space, their silks and velvets creating a sea of color that shifted and swirled with each new arrival. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat King Edward himself, a young man with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty that rivaled any of his ancestors. "The Duke of Thornwood," the herald announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, and his companion, the Lady Amara. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the hall turned toward them. Every whisper died on every lip. It was as if the entire court had drawn a collective breath and forgotten to release it. Sebastian felt Amara's hand tighten on his arm, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. He covered her fingers with his own, a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the watching nobles. "Come," he murmured. "Let us show them what they fear to see." They crossed the hall together, each step an act of defiance against centuries of assumption and prejudice. The crowd parted before them like water before a ship's prow, and as they passed, Amara met the eyes of each noble who dared to stare. Some looked away, shamed by their own curiosity. Others held her gaze with open hostility, but none could deny the dignity with which she moved, the grace that transformed her from spectacle to presence. At the foot of the dais, Sebastian bowed and Amara curtsied, their movements perfectly synchronized from weeks of practice. The king observed them with an expression that gave nothing away. "Thornwood," Edward said at last, "you bring an interesting guest to our court." "Your Majesty." Sebastian's voice was steady, betraying none of the anxiety he felt. "May I present Amara, late of my household in Yorkshire. She has graced me with her companionship for the season." Companionship. The king's lip curled slightly. An interesting choice of words. "I find her company stimulating, Your Majesty. Her perspective on matters of philosophy and governance has been most enlightening." A ripple of shocked whispers passed through the hall. A black woman discussing philosophy with a duke? The idea was so outlandish that many could not decide whether to be offended or amused. The king leaned forward, his eyes sharp. And what perspective might a woman of your background offer on matters of governance? Amara felt Sebastian stiffen beside her, but she spoke before he could intervene. I have observed, Your Majesty, that those who are governed often understand the effects of governance better than those who govern. The harvest taxes that seem necessary from a throne can mean starvation for those who must pay them. The wars that bring glory to kings bring only graves to the fields where they are fought. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted their entrance. There was calculation in it now, a reassessment happening behind hundreds of aristocratic eyes. The king regarded Amara for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was a new note in his voice, something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a worthy opponent. You speak boldly for one in your position. I speak honestly, Your Majesty. I was told that English kings value truth above flattery. A dangerous smile touched Edward's lips. We value many things, Lady Amara. Truth is merely one of them. He waved a dismissive hand. You may go. We shall observe your presence at our court with interest. It was not approval, but it was not condemnation either. Sebastian bowed again. Amara curtsied, and together they withdrew into the sea of nobles that closed around them like water filling a wound. That was either very brave or very foolish, Sebastian murmured as they moved toward the edge of the hall. Perhaps both. Amara's voice was steady, but he could feel her trembling slightly against his arm. I could not let him dismiss me without speaking. They would have seen weakness, and weakness here is death. Before Sebastian could respond, a familiar figure detached itself from the crowd and moved to intercept them. Lord Reginald Blackwood wore an expression of malicious delight that set Sebastian's teeth on edge. Ashford, I see you have brought your little project to court. His eyes moved over Amara with a casualness that was itself an insult. How charming. Though I must say the king seemed less than impressed. The king seemed thoughtful, Sebastian replied coldly, which is more than can be said for most of those gathered here. Reginald laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Still the idealist, I see. Tell me, Lady Amara. He drawled the title with obvious mockery. How does it feel to stand among your betters? Surely this is quite overwhelming for someone of your origins. Amara turned to face him, and in her eyes Sebastian saw something he had never seen before, a controlled fury that burned like banked coals waiting for a breath of wind. I have stood among those who believe themselves my betters since I was 8 years old, Lord Blackwood, on slave ships and in markets, and in the households of men who saw me as property rather than person. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the sudden silence that had formed around them. And yet here I stand still, while many of those men have gone to dust. So you will forgive me if I find your gathering less overwhelming than you might imagine. The color drained from Reginald's face. Around them, nobles exchanged glances of shock and, in some cases, poorly hidden admiration. No one spoke to Lord Blackwood that way. No one. Sebastian felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly stole his breath. This woman, who had faced horrors he could barely imagine, was standing toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful men in England and refusing to bend. You speak above your station, Reginald hissed. Perhaps, or perhaps my station has been misunderstood. Amara held his gaze without flinching. I am told that in this court, worth is measured by wealth and title. But I am also told that worth can be earned through other means, through courage, through wisdom, through the willingness to speak truth when others choose comfortable lies. A small smile touched her lips. By those measures, Lord Blackwood, I wonder which of us truly stands above the other. If you have felt the power of this moment, if Amara's courage has touched something within you, leave a comment saying, courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. Let me see how many of you understand what true strength looks like. The days that followed Amara's confrontation with Lord Blackwood were a tempest of whispered conversations and calculated maneuvers. The court had divided itself into factions, those who viewed Sebastian's companion as an affront to everything they held sacred, and those who saw in her a fascinating disruption of an order that had grown stale with complacency. Lady Margaret Sinclair, Countess of Westmore, was among the latter. She appeared at Amara's side during the third evening's entertainment, a masquerade ball where the nobles hid their faces behind gilded masks while their true nature remained on display for anyone with eyes to see. Lady Margaret was past 50, with silver hair piled high upon her head and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. "You have made quite an impression, my dear," she said, linking her arm through Amara's as if they had known each other for years. "Half the court wants you burned as a witch, and the other half wants to know how you managed to look so composed while saying such dangerous things." Amara glanced at her, uncertain whether she faced friend or foe. "And which half are you, my lady?" "Oh, the latter, certainly." Lady Margaret laughed, a warm sound that seemed out of place amid the artificial gaiety surrounding them. "I have spent 30 years in this court, watching the same families make the same alliances and the same mistakes. You are the most interesting thing to happen here since the last civil war. I am not sure being compared to a civil war is a compliment. In this court, my dear, it absolutely is." Lady Margaret guided her toward a quiet alcove where they could observe the dancers without being observed in turn. "Now, tell me truthfully, what is the nature of your relationship with the Duke of Thornwood? The rumors range from political alliance to passionate affair to demonic pact, and I find myself curious which is closest to the truth." Amara hesitated. In the week since their arrival at court, she and Sebastian had maintained a careful distance in public, their interactions always correct and proper. But in private, in the stolen moments when no eyes watched and no ears listened, something else had grown between them. Conversations that lasted until dawn, touches that lingered longer than necessary, glances that spoke volumes without uttering a word. "We are friends," she said at last. "Perhaps something more, though neither of us has been foolish enough to name it." "Foolish?" Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Or wise? There is a fine line between the two in matters of the heart. The line is visible only in hindsight, my lady." "Ha!" Lady Margaret clapped her hands together in delight. "You are a philosopher indeed. No wonder Thornwood is besotted with you. He has always preferred minds that could match his own." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But be warned, child. There are those who will stop at nothing to separate you. Lord Blackwood has been making dangerous alliances, whispering poison into ears that were already inclined to listen. He means to destroy you both. Why do you tell me this? Because I was once like you, an outsider who dared to claim a place at a table where I was not wanted." Lady Margaret's eyes grew distant, touched by memories that clearly held both joy and sorrow. "My father was a merchant who made his fortune in wool. When I married the Earl of Westmore, his family tried everything to undo the match. Poison, scandal, accusations of witchcraft. They exhausted their imaginations in pursuit of my ruin." A small smile curved her lips. "They failed, and I have spent 30 years watching them pretend they always accepted me, while knowing that in their hearts they never will." Amara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kinship with this silver-haired countess who had fought her own battles against the boundaries of blood and birth. "What would you advise me to do?" "Survive." Lady Margaret's grip tightened on her arm. "By whatever means necessary. Survive. Let them underestimate you. Let them think you are merely a curiosity, a plaything that Thornwood will discard when the novelty fades. And when they move against you, as they surely will, strike back with everything you have." Before Amara could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the ballroom drew their attention. Lord Blackwood had arrived, flanked by a group of young nobles whose faces bore the particular arrogance of those who had never been denied anything. His eyes found Amara across the crowded room, and the smile that crossed his face was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "It begins," Lady Margaret murmured. "God help you, child, and God help us all." The challenge came in the form of a dance. Lord Blackwood approached with elaborate courtesy, sweeping into a bow that was itself a mockery. "Lady Amara, I wonder if you would honor me with the next measure. I find myself curious to see whether the Duke's companion can perform the steps as well as she performs her rhetoric. It was a trap. and everyone knew it. The dance he proposed was the galliard, one of the most difficult in the court's repertoire, requiring not just grace but athletic ability and perfect timing. A single misstep would provide ammunition for those who wanted to dismiss Amara as an impostor playing at nobility, but to refuse would be worse. It would confirm the whispers that she was afraid, that her composure was merely a facade that crumbled under pressure. "I would be honored, Lord Blackwood." Amara placed her hand in his, feeling the coldness of his grip through her glove. "Though I must warn you, I have been told I am a demanding partner." They moved to the center of the floor as the musicians prepared. Around them, the court formed a watching circle, their faces alight with anticipation for whatever disaster was about to unfold. Sebastian stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clenched at his sides and his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. Lady Margaret appeared at his elbow, her presence a wordless restraint. "If you intervene, you make it worse," she murmured. "Let her fight this battle alone. He means to humiliate her. Then let her deny him that pleasure." The music began. The galliard was a dance of leaps and turns, of precise footwork and perfect balance. It demanded that partners move in harmony while also showcasing individual skill. A metaphor, some said, for the marriages that were negotiated in such ballrooms. Amara felt the rhythm enter her body like a living thing, her feet moving without conscious thought through the patterns she had practiced 100 times in Thornwood's great hall. She had danced this dance alone, with Sebastian, with Geoffrey the dancing master, but never with an opponent who was actively trying to make her fail. Blackwood moved well, she had to admit. His steps were precise, his timing impeccable, but there was something mechanical in his performance, a focus on form over feeling that left his movements empty of true grace. Amara let the music guide her, surrendering to the rhythm in a way that she could never have learned from lessons alone. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice singing the songs of her village, felt the earth of her homeland beneath her feet, remembered the celebrations that had marked the turning of seasons and the passages of life. She was not merely dancing the galliard. She was weaving two worlds together, the formal precision of English court dancing and the emotional truth of the traditions she had been stolen from. The result was something the watching nobles had never seen before, a performance that was technically perfect, but also achingly beautiful. Blackwood felt it too. She could see the confusion in his eyes as he realized that his trap had become something else entirely, a showcase for her abilities, rather than an exposure of her limitations. As the dance reached its climax, Amara executed a particularly difficult sequence of turns, with a fluidity that drew gasps from the crowd. When the final note sounded and she sank into her curtsy, the silence that followed was not the silence of shock, but of genuine admiration. Then someone began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Amara rose from her curtsy to find the king himself descending from his dais, his hands meeting in measured applause that others quickly joined. "Remarkable," Edward said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed hall. "We have seen many dancers in our court, but none quite like you, Lady Amara." Blackwood's face had gone pale. The trap he had set had been turned against him, transformed by Amara's skill into a triumph he could not have anticipated. "I thank your majesty for the compliment," Amara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The dance of my people has different steps, but the language of movement is universal. The dance of your people." The king's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "You must demonstrate it for us sometime. We find ourselves increasingly intrigued by the perspectives you offer." It was not friendship. The king was not capable of friendship, but it was something equally valuable: interest. And in the court of Edward IV, interest was the currency that kept you alive. Sebastian appeared at her side as the king withdrew, his hand finding hers with a naturalness that neither of them had planned. The touch sent whispers rippling through the crowd, but for once, Sebastian did not care what anyone thought. "That was extraordinary," he said softly. "That was survival." Amara squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his presence. "Lady Margaret was right. They will keep coming. And I must be ready." The knock on Sebastian's door came at midnight, soft but insistent. He had been sitting by the fire, unable to sleep. his mind churning with the implications of the evening's events. The king's interest in Amara was both blessing and curse. It offered protection, but also drew attention that could prove dangerous. Enter. The door opened to reveal Amara, still wearing the gown she had danced in, her face pale in the candlelight. Sebastian rose immediately, concern tightening his chest. What has happened? I need to tell you something. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as if the wood could provide support for whatever weight she carried. Something that I should have said weeks ago, but did not know how to say. Sebastian moved toward her, then stopped, uncertain of what she needed. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Can I? Her laugh was hollow, touched by something that sounded like grief. You may not feel that way once you have heard. She crossed to the window, her silhouette sharp against the glass. Beyond, the torches of Westminster cast flickering shadows across the courtyard below. When you came to me that night in the kitchen, I knew about the wager. I heard Lord Blackwood propose it. I heard you accept. Sebastian felt the blood drain from his face. Amara, let me finish. She did not turn around. I knew, and I said yes anyway. Not because I believed your pretty words about dignity and worth. Not because I trusted you. I had no reason to trust you. I said yes because I saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Now she did turn, and in her eyes he saw the same steel he had glimpsed on the night of their first real conversation. The steel of a woman who had learned to survive by never fully surrendering to anyone. For escape. For freedom. For the dowry you promised, which would allow me to purchase passage on a ship back to my homeland and never set foot in this country again. The words hung between them like blades suspended in air. Sebastian felt each one strike, felt the pain of realizations he had been too blind to see. You were using me, he said slowly, as I was using you. Yes, her voice cracked on the single syllable. But that is not what I came to confess. Then what? Amara moved toward him, each step seeming to cost her something she could not spare. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. I came to confess that I cannot do it anymore. I cannot pretend that this is just a game, a calculation, a means to an end. Her hands trembled at her sides. Somewhere in these weeks, I do not know when, you stopped being a tool to be used and became something else entirely. And now I find myself caught in a trap of my own making, because the freedom I sought is meaningless if it takes me away from you. Sebastian stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never allowed himself to imagine this moment, had never dared to hope that the feelings growing within him might find their echo in her. And yet here she stood, tears streaming down her face, offering him a truth that could change everything. Amara. Her name was prayer and question and answer all at once. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that traced silver paths down her dark cheeks. I accepted Blackwood's wager because I wanted to prove something to myself. That I was more than the coward who ran from his responsibilities, more than the disappointed heir of a disappointed father. I told myself it was about justice, about exposing hypocrisy, about all the noble things we tell ourselves to justify ignoble choices. And now? Now? He laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its warmth. Now I know that I was lying to myself. From the first moment I saw you truly, not as servant or spectacle, but as the remarkable woman you are, I knew that this was never about the wager. It was always about you. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. Later, neither would be able to say who moved first. It was a kiss that tasted of salt tears and long-denied longing, of two souls finding each other across distances that should have been impossible to bridge. When they finally drew apart, Amara was laughing through her tears, and Sebastian felt something crack open in his chest. The armor he had worn for so long he had forgotten it existed. "This is madness," she whispered. "You know that, do you not? A duke and a former slave. The court will never accept it. The court can rot." Sebastian pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, the steady beat of her heart keeping time with his own. "I have spent my entire life seeking the court's approval, and it has brought me nothing but misery. I would rather be happy in disgrace than miserable in their good graces. Your lands, your title, your family name, everything you were born to protect, means nothing if I cannot protect the woman I love. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken for the first time, but already feeling as natural as breath. You love me. Amara's voice was wonder and disbelief and hope all tangled together. I love you. Sebastian kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. I think I have loved you since you told me that you could speak for yourself, and I was too foolish to recognize it. But I recognize it now, and I will not let fear or duty or the whispers of those who could never understand take it from me. They stood together in the candlelight, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since arriving at court, the future seemed to hold more promise than peril. But outside the windows, in the shadows of the courtyard below, a figure watched with cold fury. Lord Blackwood had seen them kiss through the gap in the curtains, and already, in the dark chambers of his mind, he was planning his revenge. The accusation came at the worst possible moment, during the Easter feast, when the great hall was packed with every noble family in England, and the king himself presided over the celebrations. Lord Blackwood rose from his seat with a theatrical flourish that immediately drew every eye in the room. His face bore the expression of righteous indignation that he had clearly been rehearsing. Your Majesty, I must speak. The king raised an eyebrow. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Lord Blackwood, you interrupt our meal. I apologize for the intrusion, sire, but I have uncovered information that cannot wait. Blackwood's voice carried across the suddenly silent hall. Information regarding the woman who calls herself Lady Amara. She who has been received into this court and treated as an equal by those who should know better. Sebastian felt Amara stiffen beside him. He reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing her fingers in silent reassurance, even as his own heart began to race. Speak then, the king said, his voice cold with displeasure at the disruption. This woman is no lady, your Majesty. She's a slave. Property purchased by the late Duke of Thornwood and now being paraded before this court like some exotic trophy. Blackwood's eyes found Sebastian across the room, and his smile was the smile of a man about to deliver a killing blow. But worse than that, she is a seductress who has bewitched the current duke into forgetting his duty to his name, his family, and his king. The hall erupted in whispers and gasps. Sebastian felt the blood drain from his face as he rose from his seat, prepared to defend Amara with whatever words or weapons were required. But before he could speak, she was standing beside him. Lord Blackwood speaks the truth, your Majesty. The whispers died. Every eye in the hall fixed on Amara, who stood with her shoulders straight and her head high, facing the king without fear. I was indeed a slave, she continued, her voice clear and steady. I was stolen from my homeland as a child and sold in markets like livestock. I have no noble blood, no family name that would mean anything in this court, no claim to the status I have been accorded here. Sebastian tried to interrupt, but she silenced him with a look. But Lord Blackwood lies when he says I have bewitched anyone. The Duke of Thornwood chose to treat me as an equal of his own free will. He offered me dignity when the world offered only degradation. He saw value in me when others saw only my usefulness. Her eyes swept across the watching nobles. If that is witchcraft, then I confess to it freely. But it seems to me that the true magic lies not in my actions, but in the Duke's choice to see past the accidents of birth and blood to the person beneath. The king's expression was unreadable. You admit, then, that you have no rightful place at this court? I admit that I have no place here by the measures your court recognizes. Blood and title and inherited wealth. Amara took a step forward, her gaze meeting the king's without flinching. But I would argue, your Majesty, that those measures are incomplete. They tell you where someone was born, but not who they have become. They tell you what someone owns, but not what they have earned. They tell you what someone inherited, but not what they have survived. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries of injustice. I have survived the Middle Passage. I have survived the auction block. I have survived 15 years in a land that sees me as less than human, and I have done it without sacrificing my dignity or my soul. Can the same be said of everyone gathered in this hall? The silence that followed was absolute. Sebastian watched the faces of the nobles around him, seeing shock and anger and, in some cases, something that looked almost like shame. The king leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You speak boldly, woman. Perhaps too boldly. If speaking the truth is too bold, then I am guilty." Amara's chin lifted. "But I was taught that English kings value truth above flattery. If that is not the case, then I have been misinformed about the character of the realm." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the king began to laugh. It was not the cruel laughter of mockery, but something warmer. The laughter of a man who had been genuinely surprised and found the surprise pleasing. "Truth above flattery," Edward repeated. "Yes, that is what we are supposed to value, though I confess few have had the courage to test the claim." He rose from his seat, and the entire hall rose with him. "Lady Amara, and we shall continue to call you that, whatever Lord Blackwood may prefer, you have shown more bravery in the past few minutes than most of these nobles have shown in their entire lives. We are impressed." Blackwood's face had gone purple with rage. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean to—" "We mean to do exactly as we please, Lord Blackwood. That is the privilege of kings." Edward's voice hardened. "And at present, what pleases us is to see you removed from this hall for interrupting our Easter feast with accusations that, while technically true, reveal more about your own character than the character of those you sought to condemn." The guards moved before Blackwood could respond, escorting him from the hall with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. As he passed Sebastian, his eyes burned with a hatred that promised this was not over, but for now, at least, they were safe. The king descended from his dais and approached Sebastian and Amara, who stood together amid the wreckage of the feast. "Duke of Thornwood, you have chosen an unusual companion." "I have chosen the woman I love, Your Majesty." "If that makes me unusual, I accept the distinction." "Love." The king's lip curled slightly, but his eyes remained thoughtful. A dangerous word in this court. Men have lost their heads for love, and women have lost far more. "I know, sire, but some things are worth the risk." The king studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if some internal debate had been settled. "We shall be watching you, Thornwood. Both of you. If this love proves as genuine as you claim, perhaps it will have something to teach this court about the limits of our precious hierarchies." He turned and began to walk away, then paused. "If it proves false, however, there will be consequences. We do not appreciate being made to look foolish." He swept from the hall without waiting for a response, leaving Sebastian and Amara standing in the center of a storm that had passed but would certainly return. "We should leave," Sebastian murmured, "before others find their courage." "Where will we go?" "Home." He took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers intertwine with his own. "To Thornwood, where the snow will be melting and the first flowers will be pushing through the earth, where we can begin to build the life we want, away from the madness of this court." They walked together through the great hall, past the watching nobles and the whispered judgments and the ancient prejudices that would not die with a single evening's drama. They knew that the battle was not over, that Blackwood would return, that the court would never fully accept them, that there would be more accusations and more challenges, and more moments when everything seemed ready to collapse. But as they stepped out into the cool night air, with the stars wheeling overhead and the future stretching before them like an unmarked path, none of that seemed to matter. They had found each other. Against all odds, across impossible distances, they had found something true. And for now, that was enough. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer of 1464 had been kind to Thornwood. The fields were green with new growth, the orchting with new lambs, and the castle itself seemed to breathe more easily without the weight of tradition pressing down upon its stones. Amara stood at the window of the great hall, the same window where Sebastian had stood on the night of their first real conversation, watching the preparations for the celebration below. It was the anniversary of their return from court, and the village had insisted on marking the occasion with a feast that had been growing larger with each passing day. She felt Sebastian's arms wrap around her from behind, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. The baker sent word that he cannot possibly make enough bread for everyone who has announced their intention to attend, he said. I believe his exact words were, "Half of Yorkshire is coming." Amara laughed, leaning back against his warmth. Then half of Yorkshire shall be fed. We will find a way. We always do. The past year had not been easy. Blackwood had returned from his disgrace with new allies and new schemes, testing their defenses at every opportunity. The court had remained divided, with some accepting Sebastian's choice and others shunning him entirely. Even within the household, there had been those who could not reconcile themselves to a black woman as mistress of Thornwood. But there had been victories, too. The hospital Sebastian had dreamed of was being built on the edge of the village, funded by the gold from the wager that Blackwood had been forced to pay when the 2 months elapsed without Sebastian breaking their agreement. The eastern wing of the castle had been repaired, its rooms now filled with the children of village families who came each day to learn reading and writing from a teacher Amara herself had trained. And in the small chapel where Sebastian's ancestors had worshipped for centuries, a marriage had been solemnized that scandalized some and inspired others. "Do you ever regret it?" Sebastian asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. "The life you might have had if you had taken the dowry and returned to Guinea?" Amara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes tracing the landscape that had become, against all expectation, her home. "I regret nothing," she said at last. "The girl I was, the girl who was stolen and sold and treated as property, she deserved to go home. But I am not that girl anymore. I am the woman who survived and grew and found love in the strangest of places." She turned in his arms, facing him with the smile that still made his heart catch in his throat. "This is my home now. Wherever you are is my home." Sebastian kissed her, soft and slow, tasting the promise of all the years that stretched before them. "Then let us go down and greet our guests," he said. "Half of Yorkshire awaits." They walked together through the castle, past the tapestries that now included scenes of their story, the kitchen where it began, the court where it was tested, the chapel where it was sealed. The servants they passed smiled and bowed, and Amara knew each of their names, each of their stories, each of their hopes and sorrows. This was what she had built, not alone, but together with the man who had seen her when others had chosen blindness. A place where birth and blood mattered less than character and choice. A small corner of the world where the rules were being rewritten, one day at a time. As they emerged into the sunlight, and the cheers of the gathered crowd rose to meet them, Amara felt the last traces of the chains that had bound her. Not the physical chains of the slave ship, but the invisible chains of shame and fear, and the belief that she was less than those who claimed to be her masters. Fall away completely.